Here we go. Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Stephen Bird, and I am the editor of Higher Ed Watch, a public policy blog published by the New America Foundation. For those of you who are new to New America, the Foundation is a public policy institute that invests in new thinkers and ideas to address the next generation of challenges facing the country. Today, we are going to be talking about for-profit higher education, which has been described to be a $29 billion industry. Business has been booming at the country's for-profit schools, with enrollments nearly tripling over the last decade to about 2 million students a year. But evidence is mounting that some of the largest for-profit higher education companies have been leaving many low-income and working-class students in much worse shape than before they enrolled, loaded down with unmanageable levels of debt and without the training they need to find gainful employment in the fields in which they are seeking training. On July 23rd, the Obama administration took aim at these schools, proposing tough new regulations that would cut off federal financial aid to for-profit school programs whose students take on the highest amount of debt in relation to their future earnings, and have the worst record of repayment. In addition, these proposed rules would restrict enrollment at other programs that have only slightly better results on these measurements. As this audience well knows, the administration's Gainful Employment proposal is extremely controversial. While it is receiving mostly good marks from consumer advocates, for-profit college leaders and lobbyists, with help from their supporters on Capitol Hill and Wall Street, as well as high-powered and well-connected lobbying firms such as the Podesta Group, have mounted an aggressive campaign against it. We have gathered a distinguished panel to discuss this controversial and, may I say, extremely complex proposed rule. Our featured speaker is James Kvaal, the Deputy Undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Education, who has been one of the chief architects of this proposal. James just recently joined the department after serving as a special assistant to President Obama for economic policy. I'm hoping that James can clear up a few things for all of us, as I think some elements of the plan have been misunderstood and misreported. James is going to be able to answer your questions. There are some limits because this is a proposed rule, and so he may not be able to answer everything. On our panel, we have Barmak Nassarian, who is the Associate Executive Director of the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, a nonprofit association of more than 2,000 institutions of higher education and more than 9,000 campus enrollment service officials. As many here know, he's been a strong critic of the industry and has said that he does not believe the proposed rule goes far enough. We also have Catherine Mangu Ward, who is a senior editor at Reason Magazine, which is a libertarian monthly magazine published by the Reason Foundation. She previously worked as a reporter at the Weekly Standard and as a researcher for the New York Times op-ed page. In her writing, she has questioned why the proposed rules only apply to for-profit colleges. Our format today will be as follows. Each of our presenters will speak for 10 minutes, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then after that we will go to Q&A. We would appreciate it if you limit yourself to asking questions and not giving long speeches. There are a couple of other things I'd like to say before we get started. First, in putting together today's panel, I set out to avoid including anyone who has a financial interest in the for-profit higher education industry's success or failure. That means no short sellers, no long sellers, and no industry representatives. Instead, I was looking for thoughtful people who have written about or studied the sector. Second, at Higher Ed Watch, we are not opposed to for-profit higher education. We do, in fact, know that there are schools and companies that are playing by the rules and providing a valuable service by educating those who are often left behind by our nation's public and private four-year colleges and universities. We are, in fact, very alarmed by reports that suggest that traditional public and private colleges have been taking steps to reduce access to the most financially needy students by, for example, shifting away from providing need-based financial aid. We agree with Harris Miller of the Career College Association that higher education should not be the preserve of just the rich and the elite, or as he likes to say, in quotes, students who were listening to Mozart before they were even born. Having said that, though, we do believe that many for-profit colleges and the companies that own them are not serving the tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of students they enroll well, and are in fact putting them in harm's way. And for that reason, we have applauded the Obama administration and the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions for providing the type of oversight of the sector that has for too long been sorely missing. Now let's begin. James, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's always a pleasure to be at New America. In an effort to win over the crowd, I thought I would start with something a little different, which is a legal disclaimer. We are at a unique stage in a rule-making process now. We published our notice for public comment on Monday, and there are 45 days for public comment. And there are strict rules about what department officials can say about the rule in this period. They're designed to create a transparent process to make sure everyone has an equal voice. So I'm here to describe what's in the rule, what we were thinking, maybe answer some questions or clarify the content of the rule. But I just want to be clear that I can't go beyond the content of the rule and what I say. And suggestions for improving the rule are certainly very welcome, but for them to be considered by the department, they'll have to be submitted through our formal process, which is outlined in that document. So thank you for your patience with that. I think when you look at the landscape of higher education today, you see a lot of thriving for-profit colleges, and that's a good thing. A lot of colleges have pioneered innovative ways to enroll students, help them meet the needs of working adults. Their enrollment is growing very rapidly, and that's a sign that they're meeting some kind of need out there. The administration has invested very heavily in these colleges. We are on track to double the Pell Grant program. Since the president took office, about a quarter of that funding goes to for-profit colleges. And Secretary Duncan has said that he sees these colleges as a key element of reaching the president's goal of being first in the world of college attainment by 2020. So there certainly are for-profit colleges that are valuable and important parts of the for-profit landscape. Now, if colleges choose to participate in federal student aid programs, the Higher Education Act gives the Secretary some responsibility to set minimum standards for those schools. And I think there are good reasons for that. One is it makes sure that students are getting a good return on their investment, and when they take out student loans, they're getting training that it will enable them to repay those student loans. There's also a lot of taxpayer dollars at stake in these institutions. Many of them are primarily funded with federal dollars, so they're institutions that the federal government inherently has a strong stake in. And moreover, we should recognize that for-profit institutions do have a legal incentive or even an obligation to try and maximize their profitability for shareholders. And in some cases, they may be subject to less oversight from states or other entities than, for example, a public university. So all of that is true. And while some of these programs appear to be very good, there are also troubling signs that some for-profit programs are not delivering great value. And you can see in the data that some programs have very low repayment rates, very high debt loads, high default rates. And it's often true even among programs of a single characteristic. So you might have, for example, an auto mechanic program offered by two different for-profits in the same state. One has very low debt loads, very significant income gains for program completers, and the other one doesn't look as good on that measure. So there does seem to be some differences in the quality of these programs. So what we have done is propose a new regulation that would give these colleges a way to demonstrate that they're preparing people for gainful employment. This is a requirement of the Higher Education Act now, and it's not one that has ever been defined before. So schools now certify that they are preparing students for gainful employment, but there's no standard by which they can use to substantiate that they are in fact doing so. I want to emphasize that this is a draft proposal. It's not a final rule. It's one that the department has worked very hard with the affected community as well as outside experts and other stakeholders to develop. We held 3 public meetings last year. In addition, we held 3 negotiated rulemaking sessions. Anyone who has been unfortunate enough to follow this in all its details, I think will see that we took those suggestions very carefully, and we revised the rule based upon that feedback. And now we have 45 days for public comment, and I anticipate we'll get a lot of public comment. I hope that people who have suggestions for improving this rule will submit those comments so that we can consider them very carefully, and we will consider them very carefully and respond in writing. A second point I wanted to make about this rule is we really tried very hard to avoid setting an arbitrary tripwire or a straitjacket where a program would step across a line and suddenly they would be penalized or even lose eligibility all at once. And so to do that, we developed a proposal that uses multiple measures and that attempts to distinguish between programs that are doing fine, programs where we have some cause to be concerned, and programs that really do not appear to be serving students well. So the result has been a rule that takes a little explaining and maybe a PowerPoint slide, but we think it's worthwhile to try and distinguish among these types of schools and develop a little bit more of a careful approach to them. So I wanted to talk about the 2 main measures that we're using. The first is the debt-to-income ratio. So we will be looking at the amount of debt that a median completer of a program graduates with, and we'll be comparing that to the earnings that completers go on to have in the workplace over their first 3 years. And the question is the amount of debt affordable consistent with the amount that completers are expected to earn? It's an approximation of a cost-benefit analysis from the perspective of the student. Is the investment paying off? The targets that we set were based upon industry practices and expert recommendations and suggestions that we received during the negotiated rulemaking process. We're using 2 measures. One is based on total income, and one is based on discretionary income or income above a basic living allowance. We think this is a good structure, both because both measures were suggested to us, and also because by using them both, we can recognize that borrowers can afford to devote a higher share of their income to repaying debt as their incomes go up. So the lines we drew, if you are below, if the debt burden makes up more than 8% of your total income or 20% of your discretionary income, you're in what we'll call the yellow zone, and I'll explain that in a moment. It's a reason to be concerned. If you miss those targets by a wide margin and the debt burden is above 12% of total income or 30% of discretionary income, then you're potentially ineligible depending on how you do on the other measure. The second measure is the repayment rate, and that is a measure of whether program enrollees are actually repaying their loans. It's somewhat similar conceptually to the default rate, which exists now, but we think it's better in a couple of ways. One is that for a student to be captured in the default rate, they actually have to go without making a payment on their loan for 270 days. And there's a broader class of people who it appears are struggling to repay their student loans but don't actually go so far as to default. So they may be delinquent and have gone many months without making a payment but not yet have reached the default stage. They may have applied for an economic hardship deferment or forbearance, or they may be enrolled in one of our income-sensitive repayment plans and not be making monthly payments that are large enough to accrue interest. So what the repayment measure does is it says simply how many people out there are able to successfully repay their loans as measured by the fact that their loan is smaller at the end of the year than it was at the start of the year. Over the course of the year, they've made payments that have exceeded interest. In the standards we set here, if your repayment rate is below 45%, that's potentially problematic. and if it's below 35%, then you're potentially ineligible. And again, these are thresholds that we're seeking comment on. I want to go to the next slide if I can do this. There. Okay. So I think this chart is a useful way of thinking about the impact of the regulatory scheme. In brief, we've tried to make this flexible for schools. If you pass either measure, if you're in the highest category on either measure, you're in the green zone, you're fully eligible. We expect the vast majority of programs to be in the green zone. If you fail every measure, then you're in the red zone. You would become ineligible. The first eligibility determinations on the proposal would be made in the 2012-2013 school year. So schools have about 2 years from now to plan for this. In addition, we would have a transition phase in the first year. So no more than 5% of programs would lose eligibility in the first year of the program. And then this last slide is an attempt to display our estimates about how many programs would fall into each category. Our estimate is that about 5% of programs would fall into the red zone and are likely to become ineligible. We have about 8% of programs in the yellow zone there. Those are schools where they would see limits on their ability to grow. They would also be required to produce employer certifications testifying to the fact that the training that they're providing is valuable and meets local workforce needs. And third, they would also need to disclose the debt measures to their students. Folks in the green zones would retain full student aid eligibility. Many of them would also be required to make disclosures to students about their debt measures. If you were in the upper right-hand corner, which means you fully pass both measures, you would not be required to make any disclosures. But if you're problematic on at least one measure, then you would be forced to disclose that to students. So that's the idea. I hope that helps a little bit explain how it works, and I look forward to the conversation and to answering any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, James. And now we're going to hear from our panelists. First up is going to be Barmac, but you both should come up.
Good morning. I guess I should begin with a disclosure of my own. Hey, Nancy. I am, unlike James, not bound by decorum or legal restrictions or any other constraint I can think of, so I'll do something somewhat unusual. I'll actually tell you what I think. And then, not unusual for me, but unusual for a respectable setting like this. A couple of reactions. One, I want to contextualize everything I say against the backdrop of what we see going on in the sector. And I will say the politically incorrect thing here, which is that contrary to what the advocates for the sector and their proxies constantly repeat, this is now a sector in which the vast majority of participants are actually engaged in what I view as counterfeiting of degrees and consumer fraud. Consumer fraud defined as over-advertise, over-promise, overcharge, and under-deliver. Now, the norm, the more respectable take on this is you catch one example and another and a third and a fourth and 100, and every time the response is, oops, you caught another bad one. Well, at what point do you stop pulling examples out of the barrel to figure out the whole barrel is pretty much rotten? Now, is this to say every prop school is bad? No. There are some that are voluntarily doing a good job. They may be voluntarily doing a good job, just like, Chinese construction companies may occasionally not undersize the beam, just for the heck of it. They build it according to spec. But if you don't have the proper regulatory framework to ensure that the beams are correctly sized, buildings collapse on people's heads, and buildings are collapsing on poor people's heads when it comes to for-profit higher ed, because we have decided collectively, I think to a large measure because of the fact that lobbying is so determinative in what happens here, not to regulate the industry. So yes, there are some good ones. They do a decent job because they're honorable people and they're genuinely interested in the activity itself. But the vast majority are in it now for the incentive system. And the incentive system says make as much money as you can, as quickly as you can. And by the way, all the data support this. The expenditure data, which in some instances now overshadow, on advertising now overshadow instruction. Can you say late night infomercial? I mean, that's what we're talking, it's a worthless product. The main activity is a selling activity. It's not an educational activity. And then, of course, all the data on the back end in terms of outcomes, debt level, the ultimate test of market failure, which is, I mean, for a group that purports to be market-based, what is a better measure of market failure than apparently nobody but the idiot federal government puts their money into these institutions? That is the single best indication that the product has no intrinsic value. People who spend their own money don't spend it there. I don't know of a single public institution in this country that would even approach the level of dependency on public funding that this sector approaches. But because you're dealing with a game of three-card Monte, what happens is the loan mechanism becomes the tool by which the switcheroo happens. On the front end, we go in knowing full well that a quarter of the Pell Grant dollars that we're spending as taxpayers are going to go to the sector, with the results being what they are. But there is the fiction, the completely specious and frankly transparent fiction that the loans are good, they're going to be paid back. Well, here's an example, and I want to appreciate what the administration is doing. 45% repayment makes you golden? In what line of work would 45% repayment of loans be a reasonable measure of market success? So I mean, that's the basic context. I want to recognize what the administration is up against. From a policy perspective as well as a political perspective, the situation is so dire. It is so dire. And the past decade has been so tremendously corrupt that a soft landing is what it takes, and they're attempting to do a soft landing. That's why they come up with what I view as an incredibly anemic position on the merits. 45% repayment, we don't care. 8% of debt service to income, we don't care. Well, inadequate in themselves, but against the backdrop of what they're attempting to do, I think that may well be kind of a reasonable starting point. In terms of commenting on it, I want to bring to your attention two really sort of critical constructs here, one of which is, so a school fails, right? A school, and not only does it fail, let's say it fails abjectly. What we have done here is created yet another example of our government elevating caveat emptor to the status of a moral precept. Because what happens to the people, to the guinea pigs, who got plugged into an experiment at an institution that ends up failing clear across the board, on the basis of which failure the institution that then gets kicked out, what happens to those students? So our government doesn't have the ability to do decent gatekeeping on the front end, and instead will allow citizens to take out loans and go through 3 years of post-graduation struggle and then fail, and at that point the government simply cleans up the process so that future students don't get victimized. What happens to the people who did get victimized to determine that this institution is actually subpar? Now, the construct we began with was more of a gatekeeping construct because it essentially did one thing. One of the avenues of fraud that we see, remember this is ACRO now, we classify programs by zip code, so we worry about, is this a real field, is this a real degree all the time. What the original proposal did was it tied the zip code to the SOC, to the standard occupational classification system, so you at least had some metric on the front end. Is this a real field that produces real jobs? Now, there was a problem which we need to admit algorithmically biased the system, which is if the sector produces subpar credentials, which is my position, averages tend to favor it, right? I mean, if you're producing fake engineering degrees and the index is the average salary of real engineers, by definition, you're still getting a gaping loophole to play games with. But at least that construct had the virtue of creating some kind of front-end gatekeeping mechanism. We're giving up on that. This isn't to say this is a terrible proposal. I suspect at the end of the day, I should still, be satisfied that the administration has recognized the problem and is actually spending political capital trying to fix it. But let's also understand, from a policy point of view, we're creating a system in which citizen victimization becomes the tool by which we then decide to clean up government programs. And I would hope that if this approach is sustained, that at the very least the administration will think through maybe the false certification or closed school discharge as a tool with which to provide relief. The second observation I have is that the administration has done an exceptionally good job in making the analytical case for what it's doing. I mean, this reg is remarkable reading, contrary to most Federal Register entries I've read, because it really puts together a very compelling narrative of why they're intervening and how they arrived at these metrics. Again, the metrics are far from by simply the numbers that James presented. They're far from having the effect of really cleaning up the system. They do push out the most egregious kinds of practices out there, and they have one additional virtue, which for all of my fake outrage, I do savor, and that is the repayment rate. If I were with the sector, I wouldn't take any solace from that repayment rate. I want to see who's going to walk into a congressional office defending the fact that a whopping 45% of their students repay. By the way, it's highly susceptible to gaming. Keep that in mind. $1 of reduction in principal counts as a principal reduction. So be mindful of it. It's better than the absolute debacle we have on our hands now, but it is highly susceptible to gaming. In general, I want to be sad for all of my meandering. I think it's a good step in the right direction. We certainly hope the administration takes steps to fortify it, because it is rather anemic on various fronts. But in general, I think it's a good starting point. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Barmek. And now we'll hear from Catherine.
I guess I'd like to start by seconding the sentiment that I've never before looked at a proposed rulemaking document and found it to be almost a page turner. I mean, it was an astonishingly well written and pleasant to read and well argued document. That said, I think one reason it's so sort of strikingly pleasing to read this argument is because it's a tough one to make. This document is attempting to reconcile two opposing ideas. One is this sort of notion that we hear from President Obama that sort of more people in more education is, getting more education is good, and that there's some kind of intrinsic good, that there's a public good there that that we should sort of all see and value and encourage. On the other side of the scale is this idea that if the federal government is paying for people to get educations, they should be useful in a very sort of narrowly defined way, that they should pay off for the people who are getting those educations in salary, that they should be able to pay back their loans in a timely manner. And that's a very kind of hard-headed, quantitative point that winds up in tension with this sort of general valuing of education as a magical and good thing. And the exemption for liberal arts educations, the sort of focus here on specifically for-profit career programs, is a way to dodge answering that question. And my kind of broad point here would be something that, to be honest, is almost irrelevant for the discussion of whether or not these rules will pass, because no one's actually considering doing this. But my question would just be, why is it that we aren't applying these same kind of standards to all kinds of education, not just for-profit but non-profit, and not just career but liberal arts? I am a proudly useless graduate of Yale University. The federal government gave me a fair amount of money to get my education, which was in philosophy and political science. I took a course called Art, Love, and Beauty on the federal government's dime. And I'm, thrilled to have done so. Don't get me wrong. But I think once we're in the business of saying, listen, this federal money is an investment. This is something that taxpayers are offering, and we want something back for it. It seems odd to me to distinguish between a school where the ultimate payoff for the money is going to, say, investors or shareholders, and to say, that makes us nervous. We don't necessarily think it's appropriate that there's this huge pile of federal money that's being funneled into private pockets. But at the same time to say, my university, which has billions of dollars in its endowment, that they are a good candidate for getting federal money, and that's a good, reasonable use of taxpayer dollars. One thing that comes up both in the document itself and in discussions on this issue is the question of marketing, that these for-profit schools are good at marketing, that they have these late-night infomercials. And also, again, to bring a personal note in, as an occasional insomniac, I've been known to watch those infomercials and say, maybe I do need a degree in computer repair from ITT Tech or whatever. But the schools that are not covered under this rule market too. There are glossy brochures, and I don't know if any of you saw the hilarious video musical which Yale recently made and promoted online. It was a song and dance number about why you should go to Yale. They're not as good at marketing as some of the for-profit schools are. That doesn't mean they're not doing it. It doesn't mean that there's not lots of pressures on people to consume this kind of education, to consume both kinds of education. And again, they're doing so with federal government dollars. And then sort of the second point is just to ask the question of, how hard is this really going to be to do? And I think the other people at this table probably can answer that question better than I can, but I came across just a very on-point quote in Inside Higher Ed, which was Terry Hartle of the American Council on Education saying that this is the most complicated regulatory package that the Department of Education has ever promulgated. And that's worth taking very seriously. This is complicated. This is a lot of new stuff that the Department of Education will be doing that they haven't really been doing before. And with these kinds of complications comes more follow-on rules, additional regulations, and secondarily comes gaming. And this is something that I think the two folks on this side of the panel might agree on, that for-profit schools have a lot at stake to figure out how to game these rules. And they will, and then we'll write new rules, and then they'll figure out how to game those. And I don't necessarily find that to be a moral issue, but I do think that we shouldn't think that we're going to pass a set of rules. It's going to weed out the bad actors. It's going to, save the worst off students, and then we'll be good to go. I guess I'll just wrap up with what I imagine won't be a tremendously popular point, which is we do have a pretty effective mechanism in lots of other areas for keeping people from taking on more debt that they can pay back. And that's, with one recent notable snafu, letting banks make the loans. And the notable snafu is, definitely worth discussing whether that applies in this case. I think in some ways it might. But, when people buy a car, the banks don't say, well, there's we're looking at you, we feel like car ownership is good, it's something that we value as a society, mobility, let's just do it. Take a car loan. They say, can you pay us back? And there's a lot of sophisticated models. The Department of Education is essentially here saying, we're going to try and approximate the sort of models that banks currently use to give out loans, and get closer to estimating who can pay what back. It seems weird to me that we should ask a bunch of folks in government to do that when we already have this massive commercial banking enterprise that has really refined that system. So I guess just in closing, I would say 2 points to consider, big points on this issue. One, why is it precisely that we're singling out these for-profit career programs when I think a lot of the arguments apply perfectly well across the board to all kinds of education? And given that there are massive, massive amounts of federal dollars in this field, and that federal dollars come with regulation, and I think that's inevitable, and even the most diehard free market type will say there's so much money at stake that regulation in this case may be appropriate, but why are we only regulating this one slice of the sector? And then the second point is just to say that if we really want to be sure that people aren't taking out loans that they can't pay back, there is an available mechanism for that, and I'm not sure why we're starting over from scratch.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Hey, Steve, before you ask questions,
Sure.
can I take 2 minutes to quickly sort of engage?
Okay.
I agree with much of what you said. We are exempting liberal arts for 2 reasons. There is one technical and one sort of broader philosophical reason. The technical reason is because the law requires the department to make this judgment vis-a-vis vocational programs and programs at for-profit institutions, and it does not give them authority to do it elsewhere. So it's not exactly that they simply decided to pick a particular subsegment of their jurisdiction. So that's the technical answer. There is a broader sort of policy answer to consider. I don't, by the way, disagree with you here. I actually do think that the sector I sometimes represent it does engage in excessive sort of debt financing, and that therefore this is worthy of longer term thinking. But the fact that it may be worthy of longer term thinking doesn't mean we shouldn't act where we could. And more importantly, you and I both majored in philosophy. We did okay, it turns out. We may not be wealthy, but we're okay. If you go into homeland security as a vocation and come out sitting desk in the lobby of a building like this for minimum wage, you will not do okay. You didn't do okay, and you will not be doing okay on the basis of what you paid tens of thousands of dollars for. And therein lies the difference: real education as opposed to a sort of a fake version of it. So that's one point I really want you to look at and think about, because it's really well worth considering where the similarities exist and where they cease. I just raise that as a factor to think through.
You want to respond?
Yeah, since we're already breaking the rules and
fine.
just
I'm
running
fine
this
with that.
panel crazy-wise up here.
We're going to go wild.
I actually, one story that I thought about telling, and I'll tell very briefly now, is I went to a not great high school, and obviously a pretty great college, and my guidance counselor was not the kind of guidance counselor who's, carefully coaching each student on how to maximize their college potential. So he had about 5 minutes with me between the pregnant girls, and what he said to me, I was trying to decide about whether to sort of go into a significant amount of debt to go to an Ivy League school. And what he said was, go to the best school you can get into. It's extremely hard to quantify it and even to convey it, but it'll be worth it. And, I think it's easy to sort of say, oh, well, it's very different to decide to major in philosophy at Yale or to go to, physician's assistant training at the University of Phoenix, but I'm hesitant as a person who is constitutionally or dispositionally a snob. I kind of want to check that in myself, and I wonder if it's just hard for us to see, even in these sort of seemingly very practical career training type deals, what the non-tangibles of that are and what the kind of secondary benefits of that are. Measuring who's paying back what 3 years out. Again, I'm not against saying it's a bunch of federal money, we got to do something to control the flow, but it's to just say they're not in a good position and we came out okay seems to me overly simplistic and maybe not to address the core issue.
Can I get in just...
Legal disclosure.
You guys are
We
never
do have
getting
James
questions,
here.
just for the record.
I thought you were the featured speaker.
we did, I think this is an interesting conversation. we did look at some data around this, and there is certainly evidence that completers of some types of programs have much more difficulty repaying their student loans than completers of other types of programs. So, if you look at loan default rates, for example, in the for-profit sector, there are 18 loan defaulters for every 100 people who complete one of those programs. That's 3 or 4 times more than there are in the public and the nonprofit sectors. So, I think there's a lot of merit in having this debate on a philosophical level, but I also think there's a lot of information in the RRA, in the NPRN that we publish that's helpful.
Okay.
We'll cede back control to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
For the moment.
So, James, I wanted to ask you, I feel like there has been a lot of confusion, obviously, because it's a pretty complicated rule, as certain aspects of it. One of the things that I've seen reported is that 55% of for-profit college programs might see their enrollments capped. And I wanted to find out if that is, it doesn't seem like that's true, and again, to sort of tell our audience what the proportion would be.
Yep, happy to do that. And thank you for drawing a distinction between programs and institutions, which maybe I didn't make clear. We are looking at these data on a program-by-program level, and we anticipate that many institutions will have many good programs and perhaps a couple that aren't good, and will want to take this opportunity to try and increase their investment in the programs that do seem to be doing well. We did spend quite a bit of time trying to look at data and estimate the impact of this rule. Our estimate is that about 5% of programs are in the area where they're potentially ineligible. About 7% of programs are in the area where they're potentially subject to limits on their enrollment growth. And that 55% of programs, that's a number that includes the 7%, so an additional 48% would be required to make disclosures to their students about their loan debts.
Okay, I've got another one. In the what I wanted to ask you is that there was an interesting part of the rule that comes at the very end, which hadn't been reported before, or that hadn't about how the department would approve new programs. And I was wondering sort of what the rationale of that is, and why you would approve programs at schools that do meet all the requirements. I just wanted to get a little more information on that.
Well, we wanted to give new programs an opportunity and a method for demonstrating that they are meeting some genuine need. I think Barmack made the point that these measures are backward-looking. And if you're only looking at repayment rates, there's no attempt to assess whether the program is actually preparing people for gainful employment for several years until people complete the program, and then there's a repayment track record. So for new programs, we ask them to meet the employer certification requirements. So that's our proposal. They would have to have employers in the local area agreeing that they're providing training that's worthwhile, that meets local workforce needs, and that their planned enrollment is somehow proportionate to what the demand for those types of workers are. So that's our proposal.
And I just want to follow up on that. Is there on these limits? Is there any penalty if, I know they're supposed to tell you what the expected enrollment is? Is there any penalty if they don't live up to that?
This is something that we have some experience with in our program review process. So when we are in the process of recertifying schools for their participation in the student aid programs, we do sometimes ask them what their enrollment plans are and expect them not to exceed those planned enrollments. So the enforcement mechanism would be similar to established procedures that we have now.
Barmack, did you want to?
I was just, and we will of course submit comments, but I would also point out that the so-called yellow zone, the sort of purgatory of regulatory status, is very troubling because again it simply relies on highly sort of dubious mechanisms for attempting to remedy what is obviously a problematic situation. The population we're talking about is unlikely. You could read the disclosures to them. It's unlikely to make the impact, particularly given the high-pressure sales and recruiting tactics we've seen. So putting a disclosure on a piece of paper in an inch of additional forms that they sign, I doubt is going to be helpful. And the employer certification is a little Soviet style. It's always easy to spend somebody else's money. So you go to an employer, no skin in the game. Do you think this is good? I mean, why would you say no? Sure, we might use it. To me, it's very, what your unemployed cousin Vinny's certification would do as a potential future. I don't think it's very workable, and it really does need to have a significant consequence and a timeline. Again, in the interest of a soft landing, if somebody is tripping these extremely low threshold wires you've set up, and you don't want to cut them off immediately, okay, but you have to put them on some kind of notice that they either pull themselves back to where the safe harbor is or they're out.
Just to answer the question about the workability, the employer certifications, again, like the enrollment restrictions, is not something that's been invented out of whole cloth. There's a lot of precedent for how this operates in the WIA system, and that's something that look forward to the comments, but we could look at that.
Okay.
I actually just have a very small question about the word local in there. I'd just be interested to have you elaborate on kind of how that works and how that fits in if you're talking about like an online program for a job that would be done online, for instance.
I don't think there's anything in the NPRM that speaks to that question. So it's an interesting one, and I hope it will be submitted formally.
There will be lots of jobs in India, by the way, for a lot of these programs.
Okay, I want to open up questions to the floor. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, we have. My colleague Jenny has a mic, so you can come up here and raise your hands, please. There's a woman over here in the middle.
Hi, thank you. I have one technical question and one non-technical question. The technical question, you've mentioned in terms of the debt to earnings ratio, you said, and in the rule it says earnings and income, and I was wondering if you could clarify whether it's earnings or income.
The hope is to get earnings information.
Okay. The second question is kind of to what she was speaking to earlier. I've read the industry paper, and they say, why are you going after the schools on this? They say, why don't you go after the people making the loans? I know there's nothing technically in the rule about this, but if you could elaborate on the department's position on that, that'd be great.
We're talking about a subset of programs that are eligible for student aid, mostly in the for-profit sector. Some are public and nonprofit. There is by law, they're required to demonstrate that these programs prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation. What the proposal would do would be to establish a standard for assessing whether these programs do in fact meet the eligibility requirements that exist in current law.
Okay, we'll take more questions. Since you're right over there, and Jenny's got the mic.
Thank you for taking my question. So just continuing on Mr. Bird's line.
Actually, one thing that would be helpful is if you identify yourself.
Certainly.
You've said that before, but just to know who you are and who you work for.
My name's Jeffrey Hamilton. I work for an investment firm called Canadas Capital. So continuing on Mr. Bird's line of questioning regarding new programs, while I wouldn't expect any quantitative clarification here, you could perhaps help us understand more qualitatively how you're thinking about potential limits on the enrollment growth of new programs. And I guess the motivation for the question here is you could imagine a school, proprietary school, proposing an enrollment ramp to 10, 20, 50,000 students over 5 years. And so given some of the concerns raised in the NPRM, that perhaps wouldn't be an appropriate rate of growth, or perhaps it is, but I'm just wondering how you'll think about judging the reasonableness of some of the enrollment figures that they propose to you for their new programs.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Again, unfortunately, I'm subject to these ground rules where I can't really go beyond the walls of the NPRM in terms of sharing information. So I hope that's a question we'll get in the comment period, and we'll consider it carefully and we'll respond in writing.
Okay. That gentleman over there with his hand raised over here. Then we'll move over to the other side of the...
Gerald Price with Height Analytics. This question is also for Deputy Undersecretary Kvaal. It's obvious that your department collected a lot of data for this NPRM. Could you walk us through exactly what that 53,000 program data set includes and provide two specific clarifications? First, how did you collect the loan repayment data? And did you find any forbearance or deferment data specifically? And then second, how did you obtain the programmatic earnings and debt data for your debt-to-income calculations? Thank you.
The data we use for this analysis, and I think it is described in the NPRM, we looked at data in NSLDS to calculate the loan repayment rates. And the data for the debt-to-income ratios were calculated with the help of a longitudinal data system from a state that had data on public universities and for-profit schools in that state that included income information.
Okay. More questions? Okay, you're next.
Sure. Louis Soares, Center for American Progress. I guess the question's for the panel. So I think the gainful employment rule's a really great beginning, of beginning to look at issues of quality and value in the higher ed sector. I think we need to have that conversation, and it's emerging. One of the questions that keeps rattling around my head is a very simple one. So for example, when you look at practices in the higher ed, in the for-profit sector, you see practices like standardized curricula, both in their occupational programs and in their liberal arts programs, because they do have those. You see industry-based faculty. You see employer-directed or guided curriculum development. And, so those are interesting. They may work or may not work. When you looked at kind of the package of proposals that was going to be funded under the AGI, you see a lot of there are a lot of contextualized learnings, things in their curriculum, close relationships to employers. And so it's just like a paradox in there, right? Where some of the stuff that these folks are doing that are yielding these bad results are also things we were looking to experiment more with the money we were going to invest through the grants. And this is complicated, and so I don't have the answer to it, but it just strikes me as a paradox.
Does anybody want to comment on that?
I don't think it's a paradox, Louis. I would say, there are many for-profit institutions that are doing very good things and that have been innovative and have tried things that are working very well. And there are things that community colleges and others can learn from in many instances. And I think that reality is entirely consistent with the fact that there appear to be a small number of programs where students are graduating with high levels of debt, getting low incomes, and having difficulty repaying their loans.
Okay, do we have any more questions from the audience, or do I have to take over? Okay, there's one back there.
Hi, thank you. Excuse me, Eddie Ayub at Barnes and Thornburg. Just to pick up on, I think, the initial question that was asked about how you were determining income versus earnings, and then I think a follow-up question was on the data that was collected. Your response, and this is to the Undersecretary, I apologize. Your response was that you were hoping to gather earnings information. And one of the things that we've heard, in the interest of disclosure, I do work with one of the for-profit entities that has a lot of interest in this. In their discussions with the department, they're having some difficulty getting the data on which you were relying, not just for the purpose of putting the rule together, but for the purpose of trying to ascertain whether their programs are going to be compliant now, whether their programs will be compliant in the future. If you're hoping to get earnings information, does that mean that you don't have that data available? And if you do have it available, will it be readily accessible for anyone who wants to try to determine whether or not their programs are currently compliant and whether they will be in the future compliant, depending upon what action they should take in order to make their programs compliant?
Again, we have access to repayment rate information through NSLDS. The earnings information was based on the information from one state. I think that is spelled out in some detail in the NPRM, characteristics of that state, which as a whole are pretty representative. The NPRM actually publishes what the career people tell me is an unprecedented amount of data and analysis underlying the numbers. So I think everyone should take a close look at that. We put it out there so those numbers would be scrutinized with the hopes of improving the quality of the comments that we'll receive. And we're looking at seeing whether there's additional information that can be shared as well.
Okay, more comments? Okay, we have one up here.
Hello, thank you. My name is Laura Meyer. I'm from the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. Having had the opportunity to review some of the comments regarding the proposed rule that have been posted publicly, there is a concern that the rule will limit access for underserved groups. And admittedly, it's designed to sort of weed out the bottom tier of them, but when some of the alternatives, community colleges and the like, are already underfinanced and overcapacity, when you squeeze out the bottom, there is going to be a pressure upwards, and perhaps when you have and with these limited resources, and also these community colleges don't necessarily offer some of the same flexibilities and all of that. Did the rulemaking consider some of these implications on these groups?
We've tried to identify programs that are producing students whose typical students are struggling or are unable to repay their student loans. So the question is, are students made better off by attending these programs? You take out a student loan. If you don't have the financial resources to repay that loan, that's a very serious problem. It's almost impossible to discharge a student loan in bankruptcy. The federal government has significant tools to help it collect defaulted student loans, which it uses. It offsets taxes. It can sue you. We tack on collection fees that are not trivial. So if you have a student loan that you're not able to pay back, it's a very, very serious issue for you. And when you're talking about a program where only about a third of students are demonstrating an ability to make payments on their student loan, I think you have to ask, is that a program that is serving its students well?
Two reactions to that question. One, the analogy, speaking of a minor glitch, that comes to me when I hear that objection, which the industry raises all the time, is the analogy to subprime mortgages. Right? Housing is a good thing, but giving people overpriced homes that they can't afford is not realistically a way of addressing whatever housing problems you have. It's a way of lining the pockets of folks on Wall Street. Likewise, if we have an access problem in this country, we should forthrightly address it and not simply satisfy ourselves by stuffing the pockets of low-income citizens with vouchers to enable somebody to rip them off. That is not education. That is a fake version of education. It's a subversion of education. It's a subversion of access. It is not access. So that's one comment. The second comment I want to make sure people understand what's going on here. You are looking, in the context of the most severe recession in the post-war period in this country, you are looking at a sector of our economy that in some instances is returning 40% margins. Why sell crack on the street when you can legally bilk the government and pocket 40% returns? So I don't for a moment believe that even if something 10 times harsher than what the department has proposed were to, but magically through divine intervention, suddenly become the law, that you're going to push anybody out of business. What you're doing is you're creating incentives for them to do a little more teaching, a little less profiteering, a little less advertising. You're creating, if to be a free thinker is to believe that entities, firms, individuals react to incentives, what we're attempting to do is to create the incentives that bring about a vastly more justifiable form of third-party intervention, which, after all, is what this is all about. Remember, this is all happening because billions of federal dollars are swishing about the system with no accountability and no oversight. They're simply attempting to change behavior.
I would say also, though, that the parallel to subprime is quite good, and it's worth keeping in mind that it's true in both directions, that it's both true that some people, especially people as the ways of kind of draining money out of the system got more and more creative and more off the deep end, did get screwed. But that there's also a lot of people who got into homes and have continued to pay their payments on those homes and live in them, who were really helped by these products that were not traditional products, that were something that people were experimenting with, and that made some people nervous, precisely because they were targeted at a poorer segment of the population who didn't have necessarily the same culture of homeowning and also the same culture of carrying and handling debt. But that a lot of what for-profit higher education is doing is, another parallel might be, I think you recently had an event here with Gary Rivlin, who just wrote a book about payday lending and check cashing. And I've written a piece about the University of Phoenix in which I compare it to subprime lenders, payday lending, and check cashing, and it made the University of Phoenix really mad, but I actually didn't mean it as an insult entirely. That a lot of those products are, when used responsibly and within certain boundaries, giving people access to money and resources and ways to advance themselves that they didn't have when only the traditional hidebound options were available.
But can I just make one more point on that, which is, when you're talking about regulating subprime loans, if you're setting minimum standards, you are potentially reducing people's ability to get loans. Here we're talking about programs eligibility. Students aren't going to lose their eligibility. They can enroll in another program at the same institution. They can enroll at another institution. There are tens of thousands of programs that are available to these students across the country. We think some of these programs do a really excellent job educating students from all backgrounds. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that it's about trying to get choices for students that are more affordable and higher in quality.
Okay. Next over here.
Jamal Abdul-Alim. I'm with Diverse Issues in Higher Education. My question is, what do we know about the characteristics of those who go to for-profit schools and do successfully repay their loans versus those who don't? And the reason I ask this question is because it could be that the for-profit schools are doing very good for maybe older students, adult students who return to school, know what they want to do, are going for a specific purpose, versus for young students who might be struggling with a lot of different issues or got pushed out of a traditional school and just settled on the for-profit option. And to add another wrinkle to the discussion, I think another reason it might be important to know something about the characteristics of those who are successfully repaying their loans versus those who aren't, because even when you look at bachelor's degree holders, you see disparities along lines of race, as was pointed out in a recent New York Times article about minorities who hold bachelor's degrees but weren't being employed at the same rates as other people.
That's not something that we looked at specifically in terms of our analysis. We did look at the demographics of students in the sector as a whole. What we did look at is differences between programs, and it does appear that some programs are much more successful at producing students with low debts and high repayment rates than other programs, even programs that are teaching very similar things. I think your questions are interesting ones, and I don't mean to ruin the panel, Steve, but I hope you'll submit it formally.
And we're going to have another panel where we just read all of the comments, so that'll be riveting. Do we have any more questions in the audience, or is there one back there? I can't.
There's a full back.
Okay, great. I'm having trouble seeing, so it's.
Thanks. Teddy Downey from the Washington Research Group. In the NPRM, this is for Deputy Undersecretary Kvaal. In the NPRM, the vast majority of the programs that are exempt, they're exempt through the 8 and 20% income thresholds, not the 45% repayment rate. If students have sufficient income to pay their loans, why aren't they paying them back? And do you have an explanation for that? And secondly, are you worried that schools are going to start to manage the program completers to those who are more likely to make money? For example, students who already have a job, so forget about the 45% repayment and just try to manage to the 8 and 20 because that only includes program completers.
Both very interesting questions that I hope we'll receive formally. I'm not sure why you see people with relatively low debt-to-income ratios and low repayment rates. We sort of batted around a couple theories. I'm not sure that there's strong evidence that we presented that measure that. I do think it is. I do think it is helpful to have both measures, and that's a way of looking at. The debt-to-income measure is a measure of students' ability to repay their loans, and the repayment rate is a measure of whether they're actually repaying their loans. And I think it's good to be able to look at those programs along both dimensions. And I'm sorry, Teddy, I forgot your second question.
The second question is, so if one threshold is based on just graduates and the other threshold is based on all people that participate in the program, can't you just not graduate a lot of students and make sure that your graduates make a lot of money or already have a job?
Well, the debt-to-income ratio, as you say, is based on completers, and the repayment rate is based on all former attendees. It seems unlikely to us that programs would adopt a model of trying to have very high dropout rates, because I think you would see that in the repayment rate measure. But it's an interesting question, and again, I hope it'll be submitted.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Matt Snelling from FBR Capital Markets. Can you help us reconcile your earlier comment? This question's for James. Can you help us reconcile your earlier comment about, I think you said about 88% of the programs would fall in the green zone with cohort default rates, or I should say cumulative default rates, that run towards the 50% level, I think, for the short-term programs?
The analysis that we did was based upon the two measures that we're proposing. So it was based on the repayment rate measure, and it was based on the debt-to-income measure. If you have suggestions for other measures that we should be using, or different places to draw the lines with the measures that we are using, that is exactly the kind of thing we're hoping to get formal comment on so that we can consider that.
Well, I guess I'm just trying to follow up to that. I'm just trying to figure out how you can have a default rate that approaches 50%, but a repayment rate that potentially could be higher than 45% when you factor in deferments and forbearance and delinquencies.
Well, it's not a lifetime repayment rate. It's looking at how many people are making progress on their loans in their first 4 years after entering repayment.
I think there's another question right there.
My name is Jason Jordan from the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators. Without question, we all want high-quality institutions that are producing high-quality, productive students. My concern, I think, though, is if we're dealing with some of the least prepared, most vulnerable sectors of our population, are we setting a long enough line where we look for their ability to repay a loan? So if I'm struggling as it is academically, will it not take me 10 or 15 years to become gainfully employed? And should the institution really be responsible for turning around the economics of my community, or making me so much more prepared before I get there that within the time that they're looking for me to be a repayer or gainfully employed, I can meet that test. Are we, in fact, have you set too early a line for the test on gainful employment?
Well, that was one thing that came up in our negotiated rulemaking conversations with the community, and we tried to address that in our proposal. And one thing we did was we looked at income growth over time by type of credential to see if some credentials produce much more rapid income growth, and we didn't actually see evidence of that, and that's produced in the NPRM. If there are programs that feel that their completers are particularly likely to have low incomes for a couple of years and then see rapid income growth, then if they can produce some evidence of that, then we'll allow them to look at income in years 4 through 6 instead of income through 1 through 3, and we'll use a slightly higher standard for eligibility determinations in that case. And then lastly, you mentioned the economy. A lot of our data is also from this economy. So when we were looking at the impact of this, we were looking at the impact during 2008 and 2009.
Just a quick follow-up. One of you mentioned being a product of Yale, and all of us who have kind of participated in liberal education and the wonders that gives us have also probably had the opportunity to travel and do a lot of things that kind of free us for a few years from being gainfully employed. We make those decisions when we have the benefit sometimes of economics, of class, or just good mentorship. And I really encourage the department and all of us to think about this rule in the way that so many of the folks that we're talking about come to these institutions with a lot less choice, a lot less preparation, and a heck of a lot less thought or understanding about how to become a professional in the world. And so I think we are, it can be very easy to sit here and kind of take numbers and release them from the realities of people, but I think it's a really important thing to consider.
I would say also something on that comment just briefly is, I think what I'm hearing in a lot of the questions is this tension that I talked about between a deep, abiding belief that we as Americans have and that our president has, that education has public and personal benefits that are intangible and hard to understand and hard to quantify, and that even sort of unsexy, non-liberal arts education might have some of those benefits for people, and then at the same time that, gosh darn it, this is a lot of money and no one's watching it, and it's just flowing around unregulated, and so we have to do stuff like do a lot of really good quantitative work and draw a line somewhere. And I think as long as we're trying to hold both those ideas in our minds, there'll always be these discussions of, should it be 3 years, should it be 6 years, should there be special exemptions? And, you either just say we have to bite the bullet and regulate everything, or, again, I might say re-examine why it is that this is something that federal money is so much federal money is going in so many places for so many people for so many years.
I think the gentleman makes a point that I want to address a little differently. Look, I worry about the gravitational force of poverty, right? I mean, poor people middle-income people don't quite understand the extent to which low-income Americans are victims of a blown head gasket, right? I mean, our kids can plan 10 years out, and they take SAT prep courses, and there is a mentoring process that unconsciously kind of moves them through the system. And low-income people, disproportionate numbers of them, minority students, just don't have that luxury. When you put yourself in that mode, look, I absolutely empathize with the broader point you're making. And I empathize with the point you're making. The problem is this. Look, the system was designed, the entire edifice we have by way of gatekeeping was designed around a bunch of Dominican priests and people who got attracted to education as a vocation. Now, we may have opinions about maybe they shouldn't be doing it. Maybe they ought to be out there doing something capitalistically, income produced. But, that's who we used to attract to higher ed. And they did the best they could with mixed success, but really the system was designed around detecting incompetence. Right? I mean, so we have an accreditation system, we have an oversight system, all of it is designed to make sure that inept, incompetent people don't screw things up. One little event, and this is the subprime situation again. something changed. And it's no longer really ineptitude or incompetence. It's actual corruption, right? I mean, the cops in Britain did really well with their nightsticks until the other guy showed up with a machine gun, and that's when the cops were outgunned. We have a system that hands our lowest income citizens to voracious money-making machines that have nothing to do with education in too many cases. Is every one of them like that? No. Too many are like that. Somebody who went to I'll use an example that actually is a living, breathing human being. Someone who spent a year attending an unaccredited sonography program to feed her kids, who came out with 20 grand in debt, who can't get a job, who has to pay that loan back, is in absolutely no way better off. How is that controversial? I mean, reading Boethius may pay off sometime. But going to an unaccredited sonography program to become a sonographer and having a prom note to repay, it really takes a certain kind of cafe intellectualism to contemplate, well, maybe it had an edifying impact. No, it didn't. They got ripped off. And they got ripped off with us enabling that kind of rip-off.
Okay. Anybody else have a question? Okay.
I guess somebody's blood boiling. That's good.
Hi, I'm Justin Gray with Gray Leffler, and I do work with one of the for-profit institutions. One of the questions I have for the Deputy Secretary is, can you give us some indication as to how you're going to track income? I guess what process are you going to utilize to do that? Is it going to be through the IRS, the schools, or other mechanisms?
We're not going to track income. The process that we're proposing would involve schools submitting to us lists of program completers. We then would be able to get average income from the group of individuals on that list from another federal agency. So again, we would be getting one piece of information back. We would not be getting back any individual level personal information. And the burden on the school is also quite small because presumably they know already. They have a list of who their completers are by program.
Was there another one? Jason?
Hi, Jason Delisle, the New America Foundation. Catherine, you said something earlier about letting the free market just sort of decide, do the underwriting for the loans and decide who gets them and who doesn't as one potential solution. And I've just been thinking about this for a little while. If a school under this rule, and maybe make sure, maybe you guys can tell me if I'm thinking about this correctly and I have the facts right. If a school were to lose its Title IV federal student aid eligibility under this, private lenders could still make loans to these students. So we're not changing that. If private lenders still want to make a loan to these students, we still have that free market ability there. My guess is they probably won't make loans to them, which suggests that the standard is fairly good. But I think that still, this in no way supplants that free market check we have on this system.
I would just note that, in any discussion like this, there's always just the question of, well, what are they competing with? And in this case, they're competing with subsidized loans. So, it's a very different thing to say in a scenario where there's a total absence of federal money and everyone is simply, particularly in career programs, people are simply getting loans against essentially the kind of model that the Department of Education is proposing, only the banks are doing the modeling. Then, I think you wind up with a system where lots of existing for-profit schools just go out of business because it's not worth it. But right now what's happening is, the example of the tech that you described, right? The woman who goes and gets this degree, she maybe doesn't really understand the debt burden that she's taking on. She signed some papers, but the schools do set up a very good system for them where it's pretty opaque. Right now, students don't really see a lot of what is going on. And the reason that they're doing that is because there's a massive culture and also a massive commercial culture, a massive sort of standard of business in the industry where the debt is invisible. So I think you're quite right that it would be instructive to see if the Department of Education withdraws eligibility for federal funds, how many of these schools continue to exist on ordinary commercial loans. But it's also true that people will still be paying twice. That there still is this compete with free problem. That is the same thing you see in K through 12 education, right? You could say, well, people can always take out loans to send their kids to private schools, and they could just decide whether or not that's worth it. But people are still paying taxes, and the private schools have to compete with free. So it's not a totally clean example.
Barmack, did you have something you want to say?
I just wanted to point out that the rate on and a couple of federal loans is vastly above market, just so you know. So it's not exactly that they're competing with a particularly subsidized. It costs the taxpayers plenty, but I mean, plus you can get a rate half that today. So it's not exactly, the analogy doesn't quite hold, and it is true. Look, we have a system. I mean, bringing markets into this is really problematic because you have every evidence of non-viability. These things are viable only in the context of money irresponsibly spent by the federal government. Otherwise, this would not be. Look, ripping off poor people is not a good business model because they don't have money to rip off, right? I mean, that's just the essence of poverty. You don't have money to. So here's a perfect demonstration which we should all sort of heed. This is what happens when you stuff the pockets of low-income people with vast sums of money and send them out there to fend for themselves in an unregulated marketplace. Surprise, surprise, they get ripped off.
And I would just say, to sort of clarify the distinction between us, the problem is the stuffing of the pockets with the money, not the unregulated marketplace.
Well, yeah. Haiti is the heaven on earth when it comes to unregulated.
Okay, we only have a few more minutes, so if there's anyone who's got Gerald?
Gerald Price, Tide Analytics again. There's an opinion that the Social Security Administration or other federal agency could not provide you with the income data unless they have express approval from Congress. Can you address that concern?
Our lawyers have looked at it. We hope there'll be that comment. We think there's authority for us to get program level data. Again, it's not individual data, but we hope we'll get that comment and we'll have our lawyers respond to it in writing.
We got Nancy over here.
I'm here from the University of California, and I just wanted to provide some feedback for the individual, I think his name was Teddy, who asked if we had any information on why people who have enough income are delinquent or behind or sometimes default on student loans. And we did look at our institutional portfolio, quite a large number of students, and the biggest single reason had not to do with their age or whether they were independent or dependent, and certainly not with race. Obviously, one factor was their entering poverty level. In other words, if you're poor, you seem to stay poor. And the other was that you have more debt. The biggest single characteristic of those who were delinquent was that they had debt in addition to their student loan debt. So they were burdened down with debt that extended beyond just what we had loaned them. So to that end, it may help sort out, well, what are the people doing who meet that standard of the 8%, I guess it's the 8%, why aren't they repayers? They don't make progress because they have too much debt.
Are there any more questions? Okay, another one.
So I believe a number of the panelists have mentioned here the potential for proprietary institutions to game the regulations proposed here in the NPRM. And it would seem to me that we might be able to, we're all taking that for granted almost, and we might be able to cut out an iteration here of the policy process by discussing that further. I'd be interested in hearing perhaps more detail how you expect that to happen, and then if the Deputy Undersecretary is willing, how he believes they've contemplated that potential in the NPRM and, are vigilant about that. And I think the reason that this might be useful is that those of us then who, being aware of these concerns, may be able to submit formal comments on the subject.
might also be useful to people here from the industry who are taking notes. To be honest, I mean, I say that more as an article of faith than as a criticism of particular criteria, just that there's so much money and there's so much incentive to game it that really, really smart people who are heavily incentivized to do so will be putting a lot of effort into it. So I mean it only on the most basic level, and I think that that's already happening at traditional higher education institutions too. This is in no way a specific criticism of for-profit career programs. That when the size of federal education subsidies of various kinds goes up, tuition goes up at all kinds of schools, and it's because someone's got a really complicated spreadsheet, and those spreadsheets are already out there. It's just a question of tweaking the variables.
Yeah, I mean, when you go back and look at the most recent set of scandals in higher ed, the really remarkable thing that immediately strikes you is that every one of them was rooted in what was supposed to be an act of reforming a previous discovered form of corruption. 9.5% bonds, right? I mean, 9.5% bonds, they were billing the taxpayers, you love this, at 3 times the going market rate by manufacturing them in the basement. They were supposed to sunset, and they were just commingling and manufacturing, and the taxpayers were writing blank checks. And that provision was actually an attempt to close a loophole. So, obviously the department can only do what it can in real time. I have absolute faith in our Ivy League institutions and their law schools and their business schools, graduating people who, for a reasonable fee, will come up with ways hitherto unthought of to circumvent a good outcome for the taxpayers. And a number of them have been suggested here. I do think the notion of paying down the principal is a particularly laughable one, because obviously you could be paying down a $60,000 outstanding principal at the rate of $1 a year, right? I mean, that's a case of success. And then there's other mechanisms. Some of the metrics really there's fancy footworks, left foot, right foot completers, participants, borrowers. So there's a lot of room, and I assure you that this, again, those who are sitting here crying about the industry suddenly getting shut down, have no fear. The industry will remain very profitable. It will just not be, the Gilded Age that the Bush years represented may be somewhat contained.
I wish I brought a little sign that said, "Please submit formal comments."
A PowerPoint slide.
We could have gotten through more.
All right, I'm going to take
questions.
one more question, which I think is from a reporter over here. So.
I just kind of wanted to clarify, because I guess I've been hearing multiple things, including from you, James, about what he said, that $1 could count toward principal, could count as a student repaying. But with the repayment rate, my understanding of it was that it was on the aggregate for that program. So 45% of the principal, and I just want clarification on this based on what I've heard from the department at different times.
Thanks, Jennifer. I did think your article did a good job trying to explain this all in understandable terms. The repayment calculation is done per student, weighted by original outstanding loan balance. So if you enter repayment with a $10,000 loan, you sort of have a $10,000 label attached to you for the rest of your repayment calculation. If you're successfully repaying that loan, that counts as $10,000 in the numerator as well as the denominator.
Okay, well, I think time has run out for us, and so I want to thank everybody again for coming, and I think it was a lively and fun and sometimes technical discussion, and have a good day.